The Mechanic of Death, the Francisco das Chagas Rodrigues de Brito story. In the northeastern Brazilian state of Maranhão, as the new millennium dawned, parents began to fear for their children's safety in ways they had never imagined. Between 1989 and 2003, across multiple municipalities in Maranhão and neighboring Pará, one man would commit crimes so horrific that they would shock a nation and draw international condemnation. This is the story of Francisco das Chagas Rodrigues de Brito, a former miner and bicycle mechanic who would become known as Brazil's most prolific serial killer. The late 20th and early 21st centuries in Brazil were marked by significant social and economic challenges. Despite the country's transition to democracy in the 1980s, vast inequalities persisted, particularly in the poorer northeastern states like Maranhão. Children from impoverished families often lacked adequate protection from predators, and law enforcement agencies struggled with limited resources and poor interstate coordination. Maranhão, one of Brazil's poorest states, faced particular challenges during this period. High levels of poverty, limited educational opportunities, and inadequate social services created an environment where vulnerable children could disappear without adequate investigation. It was in this context that Francisco das Chagas Rodrigues de Brito would begin his reign of terror. Francisco das Chagas Rodrigues de Brito was born in 1964 in Maranhão into circumstances that would later be cited during his trials as contributing factors to his psychological development. Little is publicly documented about his early childhood, but what emerged during legal proceedings painted a picture of a man shaped by trauma and violence. During his first trial in 2006, Francisco das Chagas confessed to killing, stating that sexual abuse he suffered as a child drove him to kill. This revelation of childhood sexual abuse would become a central element in understanding his later crimes, though it would never excuse the horrors he would inflict upon dozens of innocent children. Before his crimes came to light, Francisco das Chagas worked as a miner and later as an informal bicycle mechanic. These occupations provided him with mobility across different regions of Brazil, a factor that would prove crucial to understanding the geographic spread of his crimes. His work as a mechanic, in particular, gave him access to communities and families who would trust him with their children, trust he would exploit in the most horrific ways imaginable. To understand the full scope of Francisco das Chagas' crimes, we must first examine a series of horrific incidents that occurred in the Amazon region during the early 1990s. Between 1989 and 1993, the municipality of Altamira in Pará state became the site of crimes that would become known as the Altamira child emasculations. During this period, boys aged 8 to 14 were kidnapped, tortured, and brutally mutilated in Altamira. The victims were found naked, having been sexually abused, with their genitals severed and showing signs of torture, including eyes gouged out and limbs removed. The precision of the mutilations initially led investigators to believe the crimes were committed by individuals with medical knowledge. The initial investigation focused on the Superior Universal Lineage sect, a mystical organization led by Valentina de Andrade. This group was suspected of committing the crimes as part of satanic rituals and black magic ceremonies. Several prominent community members, including doctors, were arrested and eventually convicted for their roles in these crimes. Dr. Anicio Ferreira de Souza received the harshest sentence, being condemned to 77 years in prison for his direct involvement in the mutilations. Other principal members received sentences ranging from 35 to 57 years. However, Valentina de Andrade was acquitted in December 2003 after defending that she was not in Altamira during the murders. What authorities didn't realize at the time was that the true perpetrator of at least some of these crimes was still at large, operating hundreds of miles away in the state of Maranhão. Evidence would later point to Francisco das Chagas Rodrigues de Brito as being responsible for many of the Altamira child emasculations, given that he lived in the region for more than 10 years, and the crimes shared an identical modus operandi. While the Altamira case dominated headlines in the early 1990s, a parallel reign of terror was beginning in the northeastern state of Maranhão. Between 1991 and 2003, a series of crimes that would become known as the Maranhão child emasculations occurred in the municipalities of Paso do Lumiar, São José de Ribamar, Codó, and São Luís. The victims were boys aged 4 to 15 who were kidnapped, maimed, and killed. According to court records from the 2nd District Court of São José de Ribamar, Francisco das Chagas Rodrigues de Brito was accused of murdering 42 children over a 13-year period from 1989 to 2003. The majority of his victims had their sexual organs removed after death. The case first came to public attention in 2004 with the murder of minor Jonathan dos Santos, who, before disappearing, had told his family that he was going to meet with the mechanic. This crucial detail would prove to be the thread that unraveled Francisco das Chagas' years of criminal activity. The murders created terror in both Maranhão and Pará states, where many initially speculated the victims had been killed in black magic rituals because most of the boys had been found castrated. This speculation, while understandable given the horrific nature of the mutilations, unfortunately diverted attention from the real perpetrator for years. Francisco das Chagas was arrested in December 2004 and charged with the murders of multiple young boys. The suspect was arrested on suspicion of killing Jonathan dos Santos and 16 other boys, leading investigators to murders dating back to 1997. Scientific evidence proved him as the perpetrator when experts found several bodies in his residence, as well as limbs and fragments of children who had disappeared. 2 bones were also found on the grounds of the house in which he lived. During his interrogations, Francisco das Chagas underwent several questioning sessions until he finally confessed to the crimes. Bodies were discovered on his property, and with the criminal's assistance, more bodies of his victims were found. He could point out the location of graves with precision, even for crimes committed years earlier. This physical evidence was crucial in building the case against Francisco das Chagas, providing irrefutable proof of his involvement in these horrific crimes. The discovery of human remains on his property represented a breakthrough in the investigation, but it also raised troubling questions about how he had been able to operate undetected for so long. In his crimes, Francisco das Chagas exhibited classic psychopathic characteristics. He sought to justify himself, lacked empathy, and frequently lied. He sexually abused his victims and, after killing them, mutilated them by cutting off their ears and fingers before emasculating them. The victim's mother, Rita de Casia Vieira, testified about Francisco das Chagas' predatory behavior, stating that the monster tried to help out the mothers of the children he killed because he was looking for victims. She described how she showed Francisco das Chagas a picture of her son after he disappeared, and he laughed and told her he hadn't seen him, noting that it seemed like he was laughing at my suffering. In some cases, Francisco das Chagas raped his victims after they were dead. While he confessed to the homicides, he never admitted to the sexual assaults, becoming irritated when questioned about this aspect of his crimes. There were also suspicions that he practiced cannibalism, though he was never formally accused or questioned about this possibility. In October 2006, Francisco das Chagas Rodrigues de Brito faced his first trial for the murder of 15-year-old Jonathan Silva Vieira. The trial was held in the auditorium of a local club in São José de Ribamar, approximately 1,400 miles northeast of Rio de Janeiro, because the courtroom wasn't large enough to accommodate the hundreds of victims' relatives. Narrator. At the trial's opening, Francisco das Chagas confessed to killing Silva in December 2003, stating that sexual abuse he suffered as a child drove him to kill. He told the judge he didn't remember details, a pattern of confession followed by claims of memory loss that would become recurring throughout his multiple trials. Francisco das Chagas, then 41 years old, was sentenced to 19 years for homicide and 1 year and 8 months for hiding the body. Judge Marcio Castro Brandon took into account testimony from psychologists that the defendant suffered from a mental disorder and was not completely in control of his actions. The Francisco das Chagas case exposed serious deficiencies in Brazil's law enforcement and child protection systems. Both the Pará and Maranhão police had hypothesized the existence of a serial killer, but this was not properly investigated. Serial killers still existed in the Brazilian imagination as something distant and fictional, like characters from horror movies. The authorities showed themselves to be not only negligent, but also incompetent due to a critical lack of communication between state police forces. Local human rights groups accused police of not doing enough to solve the crimes because most of the victims were poor children from marginalized communities. The lack of clarification on these homicides, carelessly treated over the years, led Brazil to be denounced by organizations at the Inter-American Court of Human Rights of the Organization of American States. NGOs demanded from the then Minister of Justice, José Gregori, the intervention of the federal police so that the case would be definitively clarified. Francisco das Chagas faced a total of 11 trials following his arrest in 2004. Each trial focused on specific victims, as prosecutors methodically built cases for individual murders. He repeatedly confessed and then retracted confessions to the killings of 30 boys in Maranhão state and 12 others in neighboring Pará state between 1991 and 2003. In March 2014, Francisco das Chagas, then 50 years old, was found guilty of murdering 3 children in 1997: Eduardo Rocha da Silva, age 10, Raimundo Nonato da Conceição Filho, age 11, and Edivem Pinto Lobato, age 12. These victims were found dead with their genitals severed in the municipality of Passo do Lumiar, with one child also having a finger cut off his hand. Judge Jacqueline Reis Caracas sentenced Francisco das Chagas to 108 years behind bars for these gruesome crimes, adding to the 277 years he had been handed at previous trials. This brought his total sentence to 385 years in prison, though under Brazilian law, the maximum time actually served is typically 30 years. Francisco das Chagas is currently housed in the São Luís Maximum Security Prison. His last trial was on March 26, 2014, 10 years after his arrest. During his final court appearance, he was wrestled away by police as he tried to attack photographers and kicked a female reporter as he was escorted inside the court. This violent behavior demonstrated that even in custody, Francisco das Chagas remained a dangerous individual prone to sudden outbursts of violence. His current sentence exceeds 250 years in prison, noting that he participated in 11 separate trials for his homicides. The international attention brought to this case highlighted not just the horror of Francisco das Chagas's crimes, but the systemic failures that allowed them to continue for so long. The case also raised troubling questions about the wrongful convictions in the Altamira cases, where members of the superior universal lineage sect had been convicted for crimes that may have been committed by Francisco das Chagas. The crimes occurred in São Luís, Passo do Lumiar, Codó, and São José de Ribamar in Maranhão, and in Altamira in Pará between 1989 and 2003. The case became known as the Case of the Emasculated Boys and had international repercussions, forcing Brazilian authorities to confront serious deficiencies in their approach to serial crimes and child protection. Mental health professionals who evaluated Francisco das Chagas during his trials identified several key characteristics that aligned with established profiles of serial killers. While childhood trauma is often present in the backgrounds of serial killers, experts emphasize that the vast majority of abuse survivors never commit violent crimes. The question of Francisco das Chagas's competency became central to understanding how the justice system should handle such cases. The psychological evaluation process revealed a complex individual who displayed calculated behavior in selecting and approaching victims, sophisticated methods of disposal and concealment, yet also exhibited symptoms of mental illness. While much attention has focused on Francisco das Chagas himself, it's crucial to remember that at the center of this case are 42 young lives cut short. The victims were boys aged 4 to 15, children who should have been playing, learning, and growing up safely in their communities. During the trial, victim's mother, Rita de Cassia Vieira, told the court her son had said he was going to pick fruit with Francisco das Chagas on the day he was killed. This testimony illustrates the trust that families placed in him, making his betrayal all the more heinous. The fact that Francisco das Chagas was able to continue killing for over a decade suggests that the victims' voices were not heard, their absences not adequately investigated, and their deaths not properly mourned by the institutions meant to protect them. Francisco das Chagas Rodrigues de Brito is considered one of the most prolific serial killers in Brazil. To date, Brazil's previous worst confirmed serial killer had been Marcelo Costa de Andrade, known as the Niterói Vampire, who was convicted in 1991 of killing 14 children in a city near Rio de Janeiro. Francisco das Chagas is considered the greatest serial killer in the country, surpassing by 3 times the number of homicides committed by the Vampire of Niterói. This grim distinction places him among the most prolific serial killers in world history, a fact that continues to shock Brazilian society and the international community. Despite Francisco das Chagas's convictions, significant questions remain about the full scope of his crimes. The relationship between his crimes and the convictions of superior universal lineage members for some of the same crimes remains murky. After the Altamira case was closed, the arrest of Francisco das Chagas brought uncertainty over the judicial outcomes. The geographic spread of his crimes, from Altamira in Pará to multiple municipalities in Maranhão, suggests that Francisco das Chagas may have committed crimes in other locations that have not yet been connected to him. The lack of coordination between state police forces during his active period means that other unsolved child murders from the 1990s and early 2000s deserve re-examination. The case raised fundamental questions about whether Brazil's penal system as a whole is capable of dealing with a serial killer like Francisco das Chagas. The complexity of prosecuting dozens of murders committed over more than a decade across multiple jurisdictions, with varying levels of evidence, presented unprecedented challenges for the Brazilian justice system. The procedural challenges were enormous. The emotional toll on victims' families, who had to relive their trauma through multiple court proceedings, was immense. The scale of Francisco das Chagas's crimes overwhelmed the normal infrastructure of the justice system. The Francisco das Chagas case exposed critical gaps in Brazil's child protection systems that extend far beyond this individual case. The failure to identify patterns across state lines, the inadequate investigation of missing children from poor families, and the lack of coordination between different law enforcement agencies all contributed to his ability to continue killing. The case underscored the importance of treating all missing children cases with equal seriousness, regardless of the family's socioeconomic status. The pattern of targeting vulnerable children from poor families suggests that Francisco das Chagas deliberately chose victims he believed would not be aggressively sought by authorities. The international attention brought to the Francisco das Chagas case forced Brazilian authorities to confront serious deficiencies in their approach to serial crimes and child protection. This federal intervention represented an acknowledgement that local and state authorities were inadequately equipped to handle complex, multi-jurisdictional serial crimes. The case highlighted the need for better communication systems between different law enforcement agencies and the development of specialized units trained in serial crime investigation. It also prompted discussions about the need for national databases of missing children and unsolved homicides. The Francisco das Chagas case had a profound impact on public consciousness, forcing Brazilian society to confront the reality that such predators could and did operate within their communities. The case shattered the illusion that serial killers were something distant and fictional. Parents became more cautious about allowing their children to interact with strangers, and communities developed heightened vigilance regarding suspicious behavior. The knowledge that a serial killer had operated undetected for over a decade created lasting trauma that extended far beyond the direct victims of his crimes. Francisco das Chagas Rodrigues de Brito received a cumulative sentence exceeding 385 years in prison across his multiple trials. However, under Brazilian law, the maximum time that can actually be served is typically 30 years, meaning that Francisco das Chagas could theoretically be eligible for release despite the enormity of his crimes. This discrepancy between the symbolic sentences handed down by courts and the practical reality of the prison system raises questions about whether justice has truly been served. For the families of the 42 victims, no sentence could truly provide adequate justice for their losses. The Francisco das Chagas case transcended national boundaries, becoming a symbol of institutional failure and systemic neglect of vulnerable populations. The international dimension served as a catalyst for discussions about how serial crimes are investigated and prosecuted in developing nations. The case raised questions about broader issues of child protection and law enforcement coordination in Brazil, highlighting the specific failures while drawing attention to systematic problems that extended beyond this individual case. The investigation of Francisco das Chagas' crimes also highlighted the importance of forensic science in solving complex serial crimes. The physical evidence found at his residence, human remains, bones, and body fragments, provided irrefutable proof of his guilt when witness testimony and confessions proved unreliable. The case demonstrated the need for improved forensic capabilities in Brazil's law enforcement agencies, particularly in smaller states and municipalities where resources are limited. The ability to properly process crime scenes and analyze physical evidence proved crucial to securing convictions. The extensive media coverage of the Francisco das Chagas case played a crucial role in bringing national and international attention to the systematic failures that allowed these crimes to continue. However, the sensationalized coverage also raised questions about the responsible reporting of serial crimes. The case highlighted the delicate balance between informing the public about serious crimes and avoiding coverage that could inspire copycat criminals or further traumatize victims' families. The media's role in holding authorities accountable proved essential to ensuring that reforms were implemented. More than 2 decades after Francisco das Chagas began his killing spree, his case continues to influence how Brazil approaches serial crime investigation and child protection. The reforms implemented in response to this case have helped prevent similar systematic failures, though challenges remain. The specialized training programs developed for law enforcement personnel, the improved coordination between state and federal agencies, and the enhanced focus on protecting vulnerable children all represent positive changes that emerged from this tragedy. As we conclude this examination of the Francisco das Chagas case, it's essential to remember that beyond the statistics, legal proceedings, and systematic failures, this story is fundamentally about 42 children whose lives were cut short by one man's horrific pathology. These children, boys aged 4 to 15 from poor families in Maranhão and Pará, deserved protection, love, and the chance to grow up safely. Their deaths served as a wake-up call that forced Brazil to confront uncomfortable truths about how society values and protects its most vulnerable members. Today, Francisco das Chagas Rodrigues de Brito remains imprisoned in the São Luís maximum security prison, where he will likely spend the rest of his life. His crimes changed Brazil's approach to serial crime investigation and child protection, creating lasting reforms from unspeakable tragedy. The case of Francisco das Chagas Rodrigues de Brito stands as a stark reminder that the protection of children requires constant vigilance, adequate resources, and the commitment of entire communities. While we cannot bring back the 42 young lives lost to his violence, we can ensure that their deaths were not in vain by continuing to strengthen the systems designed to protect future generations. Behind a bicycle repair shop and the face of a helpful neighbor, Francisco das Chagas Rodrigues de Brito concealed a nightmare that spanned over a decade, silencing the futures of 42 boys across Maranhão and Pará. Poor, vulnerable, and forgotten by a system that failed to see them, their lives were stolen not only by a killer, but by neglect. If this story unsettled you, informed you, or reminded you of the cost of silence, please like, share, and subscribe to Weird World Wonders. We tell the stories the world tried to forget, not to glorify monsters, but to mourn the victims and expose the cracks in the systems meant to protect them. Until next time, stay watchful, stay compassionate, and remember, the most dangerous predators are the ones who learn how to blend in.